Lonely rancher found a body, then discovered it wore his wife's wedding ring. 3 years of searching ended when Samuel Morrison found his wife's wedding ring, wrapped around the finger bones of a stranger's corpse. The autumn wind carried death across Samuel Morrison's land. He smelled it before he saw it, that sweet, thick odor that hung in the air like a promise broken. His cattle had been restless for days, refusing to graze near Willow Creek, their eyes rolling white whenever he tried to drive them toward the water. Samuel had blamed wolves at first, then drought, then his own failing as a rancher. 3 years of drought and debt had taught him to blame himself for most everything. But cattle knew things men pretended they didn't. Samuel tied his horse to a cottonwood and walked the creek bank, following his nose and the sick flutter in his stomach. The October sun hung low and pale, casting shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked earth. Every step crunched through dead leaves that should have been green on grass that should have been thick with autumn growth. Everything on his land was dying, had been dying since Clara left, since Clara disappeared. The shallow grave sat 20 yards from the water's edge, where someone had tried to hide their shame beneath a thin layer of rocks and sandy soil. Time and weather had done what they always did to secrets, worn them down to bone and truth. A scrap of faded blue fabric caught the wind, fluttering like a trapped bird. Samuel's breath stopped in his throat. Clara's dress, the one she'd worn at church that last Sunday, when she'd sat beside him in the pew and sang hymns in a voice that could make angels weep. The one she'd been wearing when he'd seen her last, 3 years ago, walking down the road toward town with nothing but the clothes on her back and silence between them heavy as stones. Samuel dropped to his knees beside the remains, his hands shaking as he brushed away the dirt and debris. The bones were small, delicate, a woman's bones, sun-bleached and scattered by animals. Ribs like broken fence posts. A skull turned away from him, as if she couldn't bear to look at what she'd become. And there, wrapped around the fourth finger of her left hand, was the ring. The simple gold band caught the dying light and threw it back at him like an accusation. Samuel had worked 6 months of 16-hour days to buy that ring, had saved every penny from breaking horses and mending fences for other men while his own ranch fell apart around him. He'd proposed to Clara beside this very creek, when the water ran clear and the cottonwoods were green, when he believed a man could build something lasting in this hard country. The ring was tarnished now, green with age, but it still held the inscription he'd paid extra to have engraved on the inside. For Clara, my heart's home. Words that had meant everything then and nothing now, and somehow everything again. Samuel lifted the bones carefully, the way he'd once lifted Clara herself when she'd twisted her ankle stepping off the porch. The remains were light as kindling, fragile as the promises they'd made to each other under stars that had watched them both become strangers. He cradled them against his chest and felt something break inside him. Not his heart, which had broken long ago, but something deeper, the part of him that had been waiting. For 3 years, he'd kept her place at the table, had left the window unlatched on the side of the house she favored, in case she came home in the night. Had told himself she'd run off with that traveling preacher who'd come through town the week before she vanished, or maybe just gotten tired of being married to a man who loved his cattle more than his wife. But she hadn't left him. Someone had taken her from him. Samuel carried Clara's remains to the house they'd built together, to the bedroom where they'd shared dreams of children and green pastures and growing old enough to watch their grandchildren play in Willow Creek when it ran clear again. He laid her bones on their marriage bed, on the quilt her mother had made, and sat beside her the way he'd sat beside her when she was sick with fever 2 winters past. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty sockets where her eyes had been. "I'm sorry I let you down. I'm sorry I didn't come looking sooner." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel knew the truth that would haunt him through the sleepless hours until dawn. He had looked for Clara, had ridden every trail between their ranch and the territories, had asked questions in every town within 100 miles. He'd looked everywhere except the place where she'd been all along, 20 yards from their front door, buried shallow as a dog's bone. Someone had killed his wife and hidden her body on his own land, close enough that she could have heard him calling her name on those long nights when the wind was right. Close enough that her bones had been listening to him curse her memory for leaving him alone. The ring felt heavy in his palm, heavier than gold should feel. It carried the weight of 3 years' worth of anger turned to ash, of hope that had curdled into something bitter and familiar. Samuel slipped it onto his own finger above his wedding band and felt the metal burn against his skin like a brand. Tomorrow he would ride to town and tell Sheriff Bradley what he'd found. Tomorrow there would be questions and investigations and all the machinery of justice grinding slow as a mill wheel. But tonight, there was only Samuel and Clara and the terrible silence of understanding. She had never left him at all. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of coming winter. Samuel pulled the quilt over Clara's bones and wondered who had put her in the ground, and why they'd been content to let him suffer the shame of abandonment while she lay waiting to be found. The questions would come with morning light, but the answers, those might take longer to unearth than bones. The sheriff thought he was investigating a murder until he realized his best friend might be the killer. Dawn came gray and cold, like God had forgotten to light the sky properly. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching the road for dust clouds that would mean Sheriff Tom Bradley was coming. He'd ridden to town before first light, hammering on Bradley's door until the man stumbled out in his night clothes, eyes puffy with sleep and whiskey. The words had fallen out of Samuel's mouth like stones. Found Clara. She's dead. Been dead all along. Now Bradley's horse picked its way up the rutted path to Samuel's ranch, the sheriff's broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. Behind him rode Doc Henley, the town's physician and undertaker, his black bag bouncing against his saddle. Two men coming to make sense of what made no sense at all. Samuel met them at the creek, where Clara's bones still lay under the quilt he'd covered them with. The three men stood in a triangle around the shallow grave, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Nobody spoke for a long time. The silence stretched between them like barbed wire. "How long you reckon she's been here?" Bradley finally asked, his voice careful and professional. But Samuel caught the tremor underneath. Tom Bradley had known Clara too, had danced with her at the harvest social the year before she died, had maybe loved her a little, the way most men in their small town had loved her from a safe distance. Doc Henley knelt beside the bones, his practiced hands gentle as a priest's. Hard to say for certain. 3 years, maybe 4. The elements do their work quick out here. He lifted Clara's skull, turning it this way and that in the pale light. See this crack along the temple? Someone struck her, hard enough to cave the bone. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. Murder, then. Murder, Bradley agreed, and the word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. They worked in silence after that, carefully gathering every fragment of bone, every scrap of cloth. Samuel watched Bradley's face as they uncovered the rest of Clara's remains. A tarnished hairpin she'd worn to church, a button from her good dress, the small silver cross her mother had given her on her wedding day. Each item was a memory, a piece of the life someone had stolen from her. "Tell me about that last week," Bradley said as they wrapped Clara's bones in a clean sheet Doc Henley had brought. Before you thought she left." Samuel's throat felt full of dust. She was quiet, more quiet than usual. Wouldn't look me in the eye when I spoke to her. He paused, remembering. She'd been spending time at the church. More time than normal. Said she was helping with the charity fund, collecting donations for the poor families hit by the drought. The charity fund. Bradley's voice was flat as a board. The one that Reverend Kane was supposed to send to the territorial government. That's the one. Samuel looked up from the bones. Why? What happened to it? Bradley and Doc Henley exchanged a look Samuel didn't like. The kind of look that passed between men who knew things they wished they didn't. Kane disappeared about a week after Clara, Bradley said slowly. Took the charity money with him. Near $3,000, including donations from you and half the other ranchers in the county. The words hit Samuel like a kick from spooked horse. $3,000. The money he'd scraped together by selling his prize bull the last valuable thing on his ranch. The money he'd given in faith, believing it would help families worse off than his own. "You think Clara found out?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. Clara had always been too smart for her own good, too willing to ask questions when things didn't add up right. "I think Clara confronted him," Bradley said. "And I think Reverend Kane decided to keep his secret buried along with her." Doc Henley was searching through the tattered remains of Clara's dress, his fingers careful among the faded fabric. "There's something here," he said, pulling a folded paper from what had been her dress pocket. The letter was stained and water-damaged, but parts of it were still readable. Bradley took the letter, squinting at the faded ink. His face went white as fresh snow. "It's Clara's handwriting," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's writing to you, Samuel, telling you about Kane, about what she discovered." Samuel's hands shook as Bradley passed him the letter. Most of the words had been worn away by rain and time, but he could make out enough. "Must tell you the truth about the money. Kane has been stealing. I confronted him. If something happens to me." The rest was illegible, but it was enough. More than enough. "She knew," Samuel said, the words scraping his throat raw. "She knew what Kane was doing, and she was trying to protect the money. To protect all of us." Bradley's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Kane's been running a church in Millfield, about 50 miles north. Been there 2 years now, preaching salvation and taking donations." His eyes met Samuel's. "Tommy had a talk with the good reverend." Samuel folded the letter carefully, what was left of his wife's last words to him. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of her abandonment, had let it eat at him like acid on metal. Now he carried something heavier, the knowledge that she'd died trying to do right, trying to save him and their neighbors from a thief in shepherd's clothing. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning frost. In a few hours, the day would be warm enough that a man could work without a coat, could pretend winter wasn't coming. But Samuel could feel the cold settling into his bones, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. Clara was dead. Had been dead all along. And somewhere 50 miles north, the man who'd killed her was still preaching about salvation to people who trusted him with their faith and their money. "We ride today," Samuel said, his voice steady as stone. "We get him today." Bradley nodded, understanding passing between them without words. They'd been friends once, before grief had made Samuel a stranger to everyone, including himself. Maybe they could be friends again after justice was done. But first, there was a reckoning to be had with Reverend Josiah Kane. The man of God begged for forgiveness, but some sins are too heavy for prayer to lift. They found Reverend Josiah Kane in the last place a man of God should be. Henley's saloon squatted like a toad at the end of Millfield's main street, its paint peeling and windows so grimy they looked like cataracts on an old dog's eyes. The bartender, a scar man with hands like ham hocks, jerked his thumb toward the stairs when Bradley showed his badge. "Room 3, the man grunted. "Been up there 2 days straight. Ain't come down for food or nothing." Samuel and Bradley climbed the narrow stairs, their boots creaking on wood that sagged under their weight. The hallway smelled of stale whiskey and broken dreams. From behind door number 3 came the sound of a man talking to himself, or to God, though Samuel doubted God was listening. Bradley knocked once, sharp and official. "Josiah Kane. This is Sheriff Bradley. Open up." The talking stopped. Silence stretched like a held breath, then the sound of shuffling feet and something heavy being dragged across the floor. When the door opened, Samuel barely recognized the man who'd once commanded his congregation with silver words and promises of salvation. Kane had shrunk inside his clothes like an apple left too long in the sun. His once proud beard was matted and streaked with gray, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The smell of whiskey rolled off him in waves, mixed with something else, the sour stench of fear and guilt that had been eating him alive from the inside out. "Sheriff Bradley," Kane said, his voice a whisper of its former thunder. His gaze flickered to Samuel and stopped, recognition dawning in his bloodshot eyes like a terrible sunrise. "And Samuel Morrison, I wondered when you'd come." "Then you know why we're here," Bradley said, pushing past Cain into the room. The space was a disaster. Empty bottles covered every surface, and papers were scattered across the floor like dead leaves. A Bible lay open on the unmade bed, its pages yellow and torn. Cain had been reading Ecclesiastes, Samuel noticed. The part about there being a time to kill and a time to heal. Some wounds never healed. She wouldn't listen, Cain said suddenly, his words slurring together. He collapsed into a chair that groaned under his weight, though there wasn't much weight left to him. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand. Understand what? Samuel's voice came out rough as gravel. That you were stealing from people who had nothing left to steal? Cain's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. Stealing? Is that what you call it? He gestured at the empty bottles, the squalid room. Does this look like the life of a rich man to you? Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. $3,000, Cain. Money that was supposed to help drought victims. Where is it? Gone. Cain's voice broke on the word. All gone. Lost it in cards and dice and foolish investments. Thought I could make it back. Thought I could replace it before anyone noticed. His eyes found Samuel's across the room. You're Clara. She was too smart. Too honest. She started asking questions about the ledgers, about where the money was going. Samuel felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. So you killed her? No. Cain shot to his feet, swaying like a tree in high wind. No, it wasn't like that. I never meant. I was just trying to explain, to buy more time. She said she was going to tell the whole congregation, going to expose me as a fraud and a thief. Because that's what you were, Bradley said quietly. Cain crumpled back into his chair, his face in his hands. She was so angry, angrier than I'd ever seen a woman be. Said I betrayed God's trust, betrayed all of you who'd given your last dollars in faith. His voice dropped to a whisper. She said she was going to write you a letter, Samuel. Tell you everything. The letter we found in her pocket, Samuel said. Cain's head snapped up. You found her? You found Clara? What's left of her? Samuel's words cut through the air like a blade. Buried 20 yards from my front door, where you left her to rot. Cain began to weep then, great shuddering sobs that shook his entire body. I didn't mean to kill her. God help me, I swear I didn't mean to. She was leaving, walking away, and I grabbed her arm. She pulled away, and I struck her. Just once with my fist, but she fell and hit her head on a rock. The room fell silent except for Cain's broken crying. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could taste copper on his tongue like he'd bitten through something vital. She was still breathing. Cain continued, his words coming in gasps. Still alive when I knelt beside her. I could have helped her, could have ridden for the doctor. But I was scared. Scared of what would happen when people found out what I'd done, what I'd stolen. So you let her die, Bradley said. Cain nodded, not looking up. I watched her die. Watched the light go out of her eyes while I prayed for God to forgive me, to make it all go away somehow. And when she was gone, I buried her in the dark and rode out before dawn. Samuel moved without thinking, his hands finding Cain's throat. The preacher didn't resist, didn't even try to defend himself. He looked up at Samuel with eyes that begged for an ending to his suffering. Samuel, no. Bradley's voice cut through the red haze of anger. This isn't the way. He killed her, Samuel said, his fingers tightening. He killed my Clara and let me think she'd abandoned me. I know. Bradley's hand settled on Samuel's shoulder. But Clara wouldn't want you to become a killer. Not for her. Not even for justice. Samuel stared into Cain's eyes and saw something that stopped him cold. Relief. The broken man wanted to die, wanted Samuel to end his torment. Dying would be easy. Living with what he'd done, that was the real punishment. Samuel released Cain's throat and stepped back, his hands shaking. You're going to confess, he said quietly. To the judge, to the whole town. You're going to tell them what you did to Clara and what you stole from all of us. Cain nodded eagerly, like a drowning man grabbing for rope. Yes, I'll confess everything. I'll make it right somehow. You can't make this right, Samuel said. But you can face what you've done like a man instead of hiding in bottles and self-pity. Bradley cuffed Cain's wrists, the metal clicking like bones. Josiah Cain, You're under arrest for the murder of Clara Morrison and theft of charitable funds." As they led Kane down the stairs, Samuel caught sight of himself in the saloon's cracked mirror. He looked older than his years, worn down by grief and hard living. But there was something else in his reflection, a man who'd chosen mercy over vengeance, even when vengeance felt like justice. Clara would have been proud of that choice. It was the first thing in 3 years that might have made her smile. The ride back to town was quiet. Kane slumped in his saddle like a sack of grain, already confessing his sins to the wind and the sky. Samuel watched him and felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, but a kind of tired pity for the broken man who'd let fear turn him into a killer. Behind them, the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. Tomorrow there would be a trial and justice and all the messy business of putting a life back together after it had been shattered. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Samuel Morrison knew the truth about what had happened to his wife. It wasn't much, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough to build on. The money that killed his wife became the seed of something beautiful, but only after Samuel learned the hardest lesson of all. Spring came early that year, as if the land itself was eager to forget the long winter of truth. Samuel stood beside Clara's grave in the town cemetery, a simple wooden cross marking the spot where she finally rested in consecrated ground. The morning sun felt warm on his shoulders, and green shoots pushed through the dark earth around her headstone. He'd planted wildflower seeds there a month ago, the same purple lupins she'd loved to gather in mason jars for their kitchen table. "Thought I might find you here," Sheriff Bradley said, his boots crunching on the gravel path between the graves. He carried a leather satchel in his hands, worn and heavy with the weight of recovered justice. Samuel didn't turn around. Every morning for 2 weeks now. "Feels right, talking to her again." Bradley set the satchel on the ground beside Clara's grave. Judge Williams finished sorting through Kane's confession. Most of the charity money was gone, like he said. But there was some left, about $800 he'd hidden away, probably for running again. $800. Not the $3,000 that had been stolen, but enough to make a difference. Enough to rebuild something that mattered. "It's yours by right," Bradley continued. "Compensation for what happened to Clara." Samuel knelt beside the grave, his fingers tracing the letters carved into the wooden cross. Clara Morrison, beloved wife, 1847 to 1878. The dates seemed too small to hold a whole life, too simple to capture everything she'd been. The woman who'd sang hymns while hanging laundry on the line, who'd sat up with him through 3 nights when he'd nearly died of fever, who'd died trying to protect her neighbors from a thief's greed. What would she do with it? Samuel asked quietly. Bradley crouched beside him, understanding passing between them without explanation. You know what she'd do? Samuel did know. Clara had never been able to pass a hungry child without sharing what little they had spent her last Christmas making quilts for the Miller family after their house burned down, working her fingers raw by lamplight. Had died because she cared more about other people's welfare than her own safety. The Hendricks family lost their farm last month, Samuel said. Bank foreclosed. They're living in their wagon now, 5 children and nowhere to go. I heard about that. Hard times. An old Mrs. Patterson can't work her place anymore since her arthritis got bad. Been eating nothing but beans and cornbread for weeks. Bradley nodded slowly. There'd a lot of folks could use help. Samuel stood, his decision settling in his chest like a stone, finding the bottom of a deep well. I want to do something with this money. Something Clara would approve of. He looked at Bradley, his old friend's face kind and patient in the morning light. I want to help people, the way she would have helped them. What did you have in mind? Samuel walked to the edge of the cemetery, where he could see his ranch in the distance. The land looked different now. Not like a place of exile and bitter memories, but like ground that could grow things again. Like a place where something good might take root. My ranch is big enough for more than just cattle, he said. Got that old bunkhouse that's been empty for years. Plenty of water from the creek, good soil that just needs working. He turned back to Bradley. What if folks who were down on their luck had a place to stay while they got back on their feet? What if they could work the land for shares, keep what they grew? Bradley's eyes lit up with understanding. Turn your place into a kind of refuge. A fresh start, Samuel said, for people who need one. Like Cain needed, before he let fear turn him into something he wasn't. Like I needed after Clara died. They walked back to Clara's grave in comfortable silence. Samuel picked up the satchel of recovered money, feeling its weight differently now. Not like blood money or compensation for loss, but like seed that could grow into something larger than itself. Cain's trial is next week, Bradley said. Judge Williams thinks he'll get 20 years, maybe life. Samuel considered that. 20 years in territorial prison for a moment of panic that had spiraled into murder. He destroyed himself long before he destroyed Clara. Prison won't change that. You forgive him? The question hung in the air between them. Samuel thought about Cain weeping in that squalid room above the saloon, about the broken man who'd let fear eat him alive from the inside, about Clara, who'd always believed people could be better than their worst moments. I don't forgive him, Samuel said finally, but I don't hate him anymore either. Hate's too heavy to carry. Takes too much out of a man. Bradley clapped him on the shoulder. Clara would be proud of you. Samuel knelt one more time beside his wife's grave, placing his hand flat against the earth that covered her bones. The soil was warm from the sun, rich with the promise of growing things. In a few weeks, the lupin seeds would bloom, painting the grave with the purple she'd loved. I'm going to make something good from this, he whispered to her. Something that helps people instead of hurting them. Something that honors what you died for. The wind stirred the cottonwoods at the edge of the cemetery, their new leaves rustling like whispered prayers. Samuel stood and walked toward town, toward the bank where he would arrange to use Cain's recovered money to help the Hendricks family get back on their feet. Toward the general store where he would buy supplies for turning his lonely ranch into a place of refuge. Behind him, the first green shoots pushed through the dark earth around Clara's grave, reaching toward the light. By summer, the Morrison ranch had become something new. The Hendricks family lived in the old bunkhouse, their children's laughter filling spaces that had been silent too long. Mrs. Patterson tended a vegetable garden that fed 3 families, her arthritic hands gentle with seedlings that grew strong under her care. 2 other families had come and gone, staying long enough to save money and find their footing before moving on to land of their own. Samuel worked alongside them all, his days full of purpose he'd forgotten he could feel. In the evenings, he still sat by Clara's grave and told her about the small victories, corn that grew tall, children who learned to read, families that found hope again. The money was gone now, spent on tools and seed and the countless small needs of people starting over. But the ranch thrived in ways that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with the kind of wealth that grew in human hearts. On the anniversary of finding Clara's bones, Samuel planted an apple tree beside Willow Creek, not far from where she'd been buried in shame and secrets. The sapling was small, its branches thin as pencils, but it would grow. In time, it would bear fruit that would feed whoever needed feeding, shelter whoever needed shelter. Clara's wedding ring still circled his finger, tarnished gold that caught the light like a promise kept. Some kinds of love survived even death, Samuel had learned. They just changed shape, became something larger than the 2 people who'd first planted them. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of children's voices from the ranch house, the smell of bread baking, the feeling of life beginning again in ground that had seemed barren. Samuel smiled and walked toward home, where people waited who needed him, where work waited that mattered, where Clara's memory lived on in every act of kindness, every hand extended to those who'd fallen, every seed planted in faith that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Behind him, the young apple tree swayed in the breeze, its roots already reaching deep into the good earth, growing toward light.